I'd like to call the hearing to order this morning, and today we'll be discussing EPA's proposed regulations targeting carbon dioxide emissions from existing electric power plants, which was proposed on June 2nd. Before I recognize myself for an opening statement, I want to welcome Ms. McCabe. We appreciate her being with us this morning. It's also my understanding that we have a number of interns here today, some from offices here in the Congress, but I know we have quite a few also from EPA. So we welcome the EPA interns as well as the interns from Capitol Hill. And with that, I'll recognize myself for a 5-minute opening statement. Ms. McCabe, we're delighted that you're here today. All of us view this as a significant, in many ways unprecedented regulation. And pursuant to the Constitution, I can assure you that Congress is going to do its role and look very closely at this over 600-page regulation that will dramatically change the way electricity is produced in America. And it's certainly a lot more than about coal. This is one of those regulations that will affect every person in America, whether it be a manufacturing plant, electric generator, a consumer of electricity, or whatever it might be. So and this will be the first of many hearings on this regulation. Now, this proposal looks similar to the cap-and-trade legislation that the Obama administration advocated for a long, long time. They attempted to pass it in 2009. It passed the House, but it was not successful in passing the Senate. Now the President, as he has said, is going to act unilaterally, and he's directed EPA to set rules and regulations that are essentially, and many of us believe, majority of us believe on this committee at least, they're unworkable and will not even have an impact on our future emissions of greenhouse gases or affect global temperatures. Former EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson confirmed this when she testified before this subcommittee. We will not ultimately be able to change the amount of CO2 that is accumulating in the atmosphere alone. And then EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy summed up the views of this administration when she testified before this subcommittee, saying that EPA does not measure whether its regulations and the tens of billions of dollars spent by the administration will actually affect future climate change. It is simply part of an overall strategy to demonstrate the President's global leadership. So these actions appear to be about removing coal as an energy source in America and promoting President Obama's leadership perception in the international community. Now, beyond the President's unwillingness to listen to the American people, this proposal raises serious policy and legal questions. EPA has never been this extreme under 111D before. Instead of the states establishing a performance standard for units within the source category, EPA is now dictating to the states the level of emission reductions that each state must make, so statewide rather than individual units. In essence, they're requiring the states to alter the way in which electricity utility systems make power. And in our experience with oversight of this agency, the proposed rule rarely changes significantly before it's finalized. So we're talking about a proposed rule that was just introduced a couple of weeks ago. But our experience is that even after the comment period, that rule really becomes final. Now, the original Clean Air Act respected the appropriate role for state and local governments. In fact, the statute begins with a congressional finding that air pollution prevention is the primary responsibility of state and local governments. This policy is also reflected in the language of Section 111D, which has previously been used by EPA in a very limited and very deferential manner. But with this proposed rule, as I said earlier, EPA appears to be casting aside all precedent and expansively interpreting its authority under this section as a justification to force states to redesign their electricity generating systems, even though two previous EPA administrators have said it will not have any impact on global warming. So is this a power grab? It seems to demonstrate once again that this administration is getting the reputation that we hear repeatedly of being a unilateralist, that the president will decide what's best for America, as he did when he went to the Copenhagen conference in 2009 and unilaterally committed America to certain emissions without discussing it with Congress, without discussing it with job creators. So we welcome this opportunity to talk to you in depth about this proposal, and thank you again for being with us. And at this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California for his 5-minute opening statement, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On June 2nd, Administrator McCarthy released the central piece of President Obama's climate action plan, proposed carbon pollution limits on power plants. In time, historians may identify this as the moment that America got serious about tackling climate change. We know that carbon pollution from fossil fuels is accumulating in the atmosphere, trapping more heat and warming the climate. We are experiencing the results all around us in every part of the country. We also know that power plants are our largest source of carbon pollution. Yet today, there are no limits at all on the amount of carbon pollution they can emit. The good news is that there are many cost-effective ways to reduce the pollution. As the proposed rule demonstrates, the power plants can operate more efficiently. Production can shift from the dirtiest and oldest coal-fired plants to modern natural gas plants. Retirements of nuclear power plants can be postponed. Investments can be made in clean, renewable energy, and we can all contribute by becoming more energy efficient. The path outlined in the proposal is the path to cleaner air, better health, a safer climate, and a stronger economy. If we make these investments in cleaner energy, the United States can be the world leader in the industries of the future. That's not just a perception. That can be a reality. But you would never know that from the House Republicans. They're using the same scare tactics that opponents of clean air have always used. The fossil fuel industry and House Republicans have a credibility problem when it comes to claims about the economic impacts of the Clean Air Act. I've been in Congress for almost 40 years, and for 40 years, industry has made doomsday claims that clean air regulations would shut down businesses, destroy jobs, drive prices skyward, and cripple economic growth. And they have been wrong every time. This morning I released a fact sheet that documents some of these inaccurate claims. And, Mr. Chairman, I ask that this be made part of the record.
Without objection.
In 1990, when Congress last amended the Clean Air Act, electric utilities wildly overestimated the cost of acid rain controls under a cap-and-trade program that we adopted and which has been tremendously successful. They projected allowance prices of $1,000 to $1,500 per ton. The actual prices were less than $150 per ton. Ford Motor Company testified that, quote, "We just do not have the technology to comply," end quote. Not even with technology, quote, "on the horizon," end quote. In fact, the industry began making vehicles that met the new standards in just 3 years. DuPont testified that the provisions to protect the ozone layer would cause, quote, severe economic and social disruption, end quote, while Mobil Corporation predicted that the requirements for reformulated gasoline would cause, quote, major supply disruptions, end quote. Well, these dire predictions never happened. Today, House Republicans claim that the clean power plant will cause a surge in electricity bills and effectively end coal use in America. This is just the same old scare tactic. We heard that it's not enough to deal with the climate change problem. Well, it's not in and of itself, but you don't refuse to take a step in that direction because you haven't taken all the steps yet. We have air pollution reductions at the state and local level. Well, that's the way the Clean Air Act has always worked, under the EPA rules. The Clean Power Plan is eminently reasonable and achievable. It gives the states the flexibility to choose how to achieve the reductions. The goals are state-specific and cost-effective. Polls show the public supports proposals by large majorities. It's time for this committee to stop its partisan obstruction. If my Republican colleagues have a better idea for protecting our planet for our children and grandchildren, they should speak up. But just saying no, shortchanging American ingenuity and condemning the next generation to a world wrecked by heat waves, droughts, wildfires, and extreme storms is not an option. If you have another idea, let's hear it. But all we hear from Republicans is there's no problem, this is not enough to solve it, we shouldn't do anything at all. And that's why I'm supporting the President's plan.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I might respectfully say to the gentleman that we did present what we viewed as a better plan, the Manchin-Whitfield bill that passed the House of Representatives with a large margin of victory.
Mr. Chairman, if you'll yield to me, that plan simply said EPA may not act.
No, it did not. It did not say that. It said EPA could set the standard of existing plants, that Congress would set the effective date, and it also set a standard for new coal-powered plants. But anyway, we did submit a proposal. It's waiting in the U.S. Senate for action now. And
you think that will solve the problem of greenhouse gases?
You said we are not submitting a proposal. That was one of our proposals.
Does your proposal accomplish solving the problem?
We feel quite confident. By the way, our energy emissions are the lowest today. They've been in 20 years.
And
ours, and our Manchin-Whitfield bill would even be make it even better. At this time, I'd like to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, chairman of the full committee, is not here, so I'm going to recognize Mr. Barton of Texas. And if he does not utilize all of his time, if he wants to yield to someone else, that would be great.
Right. Does the chairman know if there are other members on our side that wish time?
Is there anyone that would like time? You want any time, Mr. Shimkus? Okay. All right, then I'll recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, and our witness and folks in the audience, one could argue that the audacity of this proposal is so breathtaking that in and of itself it is a health hazard, because it literally takes my breath away that what they have proposed. In the case of my state, Texas, if Texas were to implement this in its entirety between 2012 and 2030, we would have to reduce CO2 emissions by 41%. 41%. We would also, in terms of the national total, have to reduce CO2 emissions. Our CO2 emissions would be 25% of the national total in one state. Now, I understand that Texas is somewhat unique because we still are creating jobs in our state. We still have an economy that's growing. In fact, over half of all the net new jobs created in the country in the last 10 years have been created in Texas. Most people think that's a good thing, but apparently the Obama administration thinks that is a bad thing. So it is punitive in its nature. As Chairman Whitfield has pointed out, there are no health claims. There is nobody claiming that this actually improves the public health, which is the #1 goal of the Clean Air Act. there's no net environmental benefit. Even if one were to be a global warming believer, which I am not, this doesn't allege or that there are any net benefits to changing global warming. What it is an exercise in political arrogance that the EPA has the power, although even that's debatable. Under the Clean Air Act, all these power plants that are currently in operation are regulated under Section 112 of the Clean Air Act. This claims that we can now regulate those same power plants that are already regulated under Section 111D. That's of questionable legal standing, and I believe that the courts will overturn this proposed regulation if it comes to that on that basis alone. My good friend from California, in his opening statement, referred to carbon pollution. Well, actually, what we're regulating is CO2, carbon dioxide, which I am creating as I speak, and which every person in this room is creating as you breathe in and out. Now, I don't know about the rest of the people, but I don't believe everybody that's alive and breathing is a CO2 mobile source polluter. That may be the stance of the Obama administration, but it's certainly not my stance. So calling CO2 to be pollution doesn't make it so. I could call Mr. Waxman a conservative, but that would not make him a conservative, or he could call me a liberal, but that would not make me a liberal. Mr. Chairman, we need to seriously review this proposal, and I think as the subcommittee does, and if necessary the full committee does, we will come to the conclusion that this is more of a political proposal than it is an environmental proposal. And again, I pointed out Texas has to reduce its CO2 emissions from the baseline of 2012 by 41%, Louisiana 50%, Florida 28%, Pennsylvania 25%, Arizona 45%, Oklahoma 40%, Illinois 20%, New York 49%, Alabama 24%, Arkansas 46%. What's glaring about this list, and that's the top 10 states, the state with the greatest population base and the state with the largest environmental problems, at least in the Los Angeles Basin, the Golden Gate state of California is not even on the top 10 list, and they're the #1 state in terms of population. So I could go on and on, Mr. Chairman, but I've only got 29 seconds. Simply let me say that we have great respect for the EPA. I voted for the Clean Air Act amendments in the early 90s. This proposal does not comport with my understanding of what the Clean Air Act amendments were when we passed them in this committee over 20 years ago. And with that, I would yield back to the Chairman.
The gentleman yields back, and at this time recognize the gentleman from Chicago, the ranking member, Mr. Rush, for his 5-minute opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing on the EPA's Clean Power Rule. As part of President Obama's climate action plan to cut carbon pollution and help mitigate the disastrous effects of climate change, this rule will allow EPA to use its existing authority under the Clean Air Act to control carbon pollution from existing fossil fuel-fired power plants. And, Mr. Chairman, I must say that this rule could not be more timely, as these power plants account for the largest source of greenhouse gases from stationary sources in this country, and they are responsible for about 1/3 of the total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, with no current federal limits on their emissions of carbon pollution. This new proposal seeks to cut emissions by 30% compared with the 2005 levels by 2030, and it gives states great flexibility when implementing the rule based on their existing utility infrastructure and policies. Mr. Chairman, while we hear from some industry groups and opponents of any type of regulation that these new rules will be costly and overburdensome, the newly released report by the Office of Management and Budget contradicts that claim. From the annual OMB reports to Congress, we know that for the 34 major EPA rules issued between 2003 and 2013, the benefits have greatly exceeded the cost. In fact, Mr. Chairman, it was 2 rules issued under the George W. Bush administration: the Clean Air Interstate Rule issued in 2005 and the Particle Pollution Rule issued in 2007 that brought about the highest estimated benefits. More importantly, the science, Mr. Chairman, is settled. Climate change is real, and it is negatively impacting the lives and livelihoods of the American people. We see this in extreme weather events and everything from destructive flooding on our coast to relentless wildfires in the West to costly drought and crop loss in the plains and in my beloved Midwest. That is why, Mr. Chairman, 4 former Republican U.S. EPA administrators who served under Presidents Nixon and Reagan and George H.W. and George W. Bush all praised the agency's climate change rule in a Senate hearing just yesterday. As George W. Bush's first EPA administrator, Christine Todd Whitman, told the Senate Clean Air and Nuclear Safety Subcommittee, and I quote, "The issue has been settled. EPA does have the authority. The law says so. The Supreme Court has said so twice. That matter, I now believe, should be put to rest." Mr. Chairman, end of quote. The American people expect their leaders to act to address this serious threat, not only to our environment, but to our national security. Even President Reagan's former EPA administrator, Lee Thomas, agreed that the science is settled on this matter, telling the same panel just on yesterday, I quote, "We know that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are warming the atmosphere. We know they have contributed to a more than 1.5 degree Fahrenheit rise in temperature," end of quote. Mr. Chairman, if Congress refuses to address this issue as the American people demand, and at the very least we should allow EPA to do its rule, do its job, and act accordingly, then this rule will go a long way in helping us to begin to address this dire issue. I look forward to hearing from our witness today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. The gentleman yields back. His time has expired. And at this time, I'm going to recognize Ms. McCabe because we're going to give her 5 minutes to give her views on this issue. And as I said in the beginning, we do look forward to your testimony and the opportunity to ask you questions. So, Ms. McCabe, you're recognized for 5 minutes. I'm not positive that your microphone is on.
There we go. Thank you, Chairman Whitfield. Ranking Member Rush, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on EPA's recently issued Clean Power Plan proposal. Climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time. It already threatens human health and welfare and economic well-being, and if left unchecked, it will have devastating impacts on the United States and on the planet. The science is clear, the risks are clear, and the high costs of inaction are clear. We must act. That's why President Obama laid out a climate action plan and why on June 2nd, the administrator signed the proposed Clean Power Plan to cut carbon pollution, build a more resilient nation, and lead the world in our global climate fight. Power plants are the largest source of carbon dioxide emissions in the United States, accounting for roughly 1/3 of all domestic greenhouse gas emissions. While the United States has limits in place for the level of arsenic, mercury, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particle pollution that power plants can emit, there are currently no national limits on carbon pollution levels. EPA's proposed Clean Power Plan will cut hundreds of millions of tons of carbon pollution and hundreds of thousands of tons of other harmful air pollutants from existing power plants. Together, these reductions will provide important health benefits to our most vulnerable citizens, including our children. The Clean Power Plan is a critical step forward. Our plan is built on advice and information from states, cities, businesses, utilities, and thousands of people about the actions they are already taking to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. The plan aims to cut energy waste and leverage cleaner energy sources by doing two things. First, it uses a national framework to set achievable state-specific goals to cut carbon pollution per megawatt hour of electricity generated. And second, it empowers the states to chart their own customized path to meet their goals. We know that coal and natural gas play a significant role in a diverse national energy mix. This plan does not change that. It builds on action already underway to modernize aging plants, increase efficiency, and lower pollution, and paves a more certain path for conventional fuels in a clean energy economy. The EPA's stakeholder outreach and public engagement in preparation for this rule was unprecedented. Starting last summer, we held 11 public listening sessions around the country. We participated in hundreds of meetings with a broad range of stakeholders across the country and talked with every single state. Now, the second phase of our public engagement has begun. We've already had dozens of calls with states and other stakeholders, and the more formal public process, both a public comment period and public hearings, will provide further opportunity for stakeholders and the general public to provide input. These are not mere words. This is a proposal, and we want and need input from the public. That's why we have already engaged states, utilities, and other stakeholders to get their feedback. To craft state goals, we looked at where states are today, and we followed where they're going. Each state is different, so each goal and each path can be different. The goals spring from smart and sensible opportunities that states and businesses are taking advantage of right now. Under the proposal, the states have a flexible compliance path that allows them to design plans sensitive to their needs, including considering jobs and communities in a transitioning energy world. It allows them enough time, 15 years from when the rule is final until compliance with the final target, to consider and make the right investments, ensure reliability, and avoid stranded assets. Our plan doesn't just give states more options, it gives entrepreneurs and investors more options too, by unleashing the market forces that drive innovation and investment in cleaner power and low-carbon technologies. All told, in 2030, when states meet their goals, there will be about 30% less carbon pollution from the power sector across the U.S. when compared to 2005 levels, 730 million metric tons of carbon dioxide out of the air. In addition, we will cut pollution that causes smog and soot by 25%. The first year that these standards go into effect, we'll avoid up to 100,000 asthma attacks and 2,100 heart attacks, and the numbers go up from there. In 2030, the Clean Power Plan will deliver climate and health benefits of up to $90 billion. And for soot and smog reductions alone, that means for every dollar we invest in the plan, families will see $7 in health benefits. And because energy efficiency is such a smart, cost-effective strategy, we predict that in 2030, average electricity bills for American families will be 8% cheaper. President Obama's Climate Action Plan provides a roadmap for federal action to meet the pressing challenge of a changing climate, promoting clean energy solutions that capitalize on American innovation and drive economic growth, and providing a role for a range of fuels, including coal and natural gas. The proposal sets targets and a reasonable schedule that can be achieved by every state using measures they choose themselves to suit their own needs. The EPA looks forward to discussion of the proposal over the next several months, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, Ms. McCabe, thank you so much again. And I neglected to mention that she is the acting assistant administrator over at EPA. And so we do appreciate your being here. This time I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions and statements. I've noticed, Ms. McCabe, that sometime when we have our question period, we oftentimes make statements. So I'll probably do a little bit of both. The first thing I want to do, I want to read a statement by a former IPCC coordinating lead article coordinator. His name is Dr. Stephen Schneider. Of course, that's the International Panel on Climate Change, which I think is recognized as the world leader in this issue of climate change. But Dr. Schneider made this statement. He said, on one hand, as scientists, we are ethically bound to the scientific method, in effect promising to tell the truth, which means we must include all the doubts, the caveats, the ifs, and the buts. On the other hand, we are human beings, and we want a better world, and to do that, we must have media support. So we must offer up scary scenarios, make dramatic statements, and do not mention any scientific doubt. And then he concluded by saying, so we decide what must be done to be most effective in getting our message out. And I say that because you were really positive in your statement, and it's our responsibility to raise doubts about these kinds of regulations that have such an impact everywhere. And so I just wanted, Dr. Schneider is not the only lead coordinator that has made these statements. Others have said we have to make them dramatic to put political pressure on political leaders. Others have said we use the worst case model scenarios. So as I said in the beginning, our responsibility is to try to focus in and see really what is going on here. And so first question I'd like to ask you this morning, I touched on it in my opening statement. EPA's carbon dioxide regulations for power plants are being pursued under Section 111D. And it's my understanding that you all have issued regulations under that section on 5 occasions. And now, Section 111D has traditionally focused, and in fact, of those 5 times, it's always focused on emission standards for specific sources, specific units. And it has never been attempted to do it in a statewide way. And that's what your recent proposal does. It sets a standard that can be achieved only statewide. What precedent under Section 111D is there for this type of standard setting which has never been done before?
There actually have been 6 regulations issued under 111D, the last one being the Clean Air Mercury Rule in 2005, which addressed this sector. And that took an approach that allowed utilities to trade among themselves to reduce emissions. But the fact is that what we've done in this rule is completely within the 4 corners of 111D, which directs us to identify the best system of emission reduction that's been adequately demonstrated for the particular sector that we're looking at. And in the case of the power sector, it is a fully integrated system that encompasses the kinds of technologies that we included in the rule, and we know that because that's what we heard from states and utilities. These are the things they are already doing to reduce carbon from fossil power plants.
But, you know, in this rule, you, for the first time, I mean, you basically are directing the states on setting up renewable mandates. You're setting the efficiency of the coal plants. You're determining the natural gas capacity, what percent of the capacity must be run. You're setting consumer demand. You're going further than you've ever done before in my opinion.
We're not actually setting any mandates.
But you set this out in the regulation.
But they're not mandates. The states have absolute flexibility to use whatever.
Don't they have to
measures.
meet those 4 standards?
They do not have to meet those 4 standards. Those were the.
They have to meet your target, though.
They have to meet the overall carbon intensity target, but they have complete flexibility to get there however they choose, which is what they told us.
Well, we're going to
they wanted.
explore it some more, but I have 15 seconds left. I want to ask you one other question. One of the real concerns we have, now this relates to the new power plant rule. We can't build a new plant in America because the technology is not there that commercially makes it feasible. The Kemper plant in Mississippi is like a $5 billion cost overrun. In Europe, they're closing down natural gas plants. They are mothballing them because the natural gas prices are so high coming out of Russia. So they're building new coal-powered plants, and last year they imported 53% of our coal exports. So they have the flexibility, if gas prices go up, to build a new plant. We don't have that flexibility. Do you think that that is fair to the American people?
I actually disagree respectfully, Chairman. We think that new coal plants can be built under the new rule, and they are going forward.
At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend you, Ms. McCabe. I want to commend the EPA. I want to commend all your colleagues for the way that you have approached this proposal. I think that you have been exceedingly open during this process of creating this proposal, and from what I hear today, that this process is not concluded, that there will be more and more opportunities for states and stakeholders to add their voices and to look at this proposal and to engage positive commentary with you on this proposal. And you've already reached out, asked for suggestions, and been guided by that feedback as you crafted your plan. And I'm from the Midwest, and we get a lot of our electricity from coal. We have a higher carbon pollution rate at the beginning, starting out at the gate. But it also means that we have more opportunities for cost-effective reductions. And I want you, if you would, explain to me and to others in more detail how you develop the state's goals, particularly for the Midwest, and how the different situations in the different states are reflected in the individual state goals.
That's a very good question, Congressman Rush, and one that we've been getting a lot from people. And it really goes back to the fundamental approach that we took in this rule, which is to take every state from where it started. One of the loudest things that we heard from states was, please don't do a one-size-fits-all, every plant across the country has to meet a certain emission limit. Give us flexibility and recognize that states are in different places in terms of their energy mix, the age of their plants, and all that sort of thing. So that's the approach that we took. We looked across the whole country at the power sector, and we looked at the things that people are already doing. And there are many things that can be done to reduce carbon from the existing fleet, but we found 4 that were the most prominent and the most promising, we thought, to satisfy the standard of best system of emission reduction. And those things are, let's have the coal and gas plants be as absolutely efficient as they can be, so that we get every electron, as many electrons as possible for every ton of coal that's burned. And we found that a lot of efficiency improvements are being made across the country. We then looked at what else are states and utilities doing to reduce their carbon intensity. Well, they're using their gas plants more than their coal plants, and that's due to a lot of reasons, but it results in less carbon. So that was number 2. Number 3 was that states all across the country are looking at increasing the amount of energy they get from renewable sources, from zero carbon emitting sources. And that's a very positive trend being pursued by a lot of people. So that was our third element. And fourth was the great interest across the country in almost every state to employ energy efficiency or demand side so that we're more efficient. We know there's many, many ways to waste less energy. And all of these things are important in order to bring carbon down as well as other pollutants. So we came up with a national framework that set a reasonable and moderate expectation for each of those four, recognizing that those were not the only things that states could do. And we then looked at every state, and we took the most recent information that we had for the power sector, which was 2012, and we applied those four building blocks, we call them, to each state. And that generated a carbon intensity rate that if those were applied, that's where that state would get. And these are things that we think are very reasonable to achieve.
Thank you so very much. My constituents, when they heard about this proposed rule, the thing that was most important in their minds was the price of electricity. My friends on the other side here, they have been engaged in a lot of fear-mongering about the cost of electricity is going to increase and be unaffordable by my low-income constituents. And my question to you is, how will the Clean Power Plan affect the electricity bills for my constituents?
Well, the first and most important thing to say is that each state will be in charge of designing its own plan. So that means two things. One is that they will have the opportunity to take those kind of considerations build those into their plan, but also that EPA at this moment can't predict exactly what every state is going to do. We did do some illustrative examples of what states might do, and so in our regulatory impact assessment we do include those numbers, and that we show that with the significant increase in energy efficiency that will be implemented as a result of the rule, that electricity bills in 2030 we predict will go down because electricity bills because people will be using less energy. We also show that the price of electricity will go up a little bit, but overall bills will come down. I also just want to note that low-income families are most at risk of the adverse effects of carbon pollution and climate change, and will greatly benefit from the health benefits that will be achieved by this rule.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time I recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, of Michigan, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. McVeigh, a number of us have concerns with this proposed rule. EPA, an agency with no energy policy authority or expertise and under questionable statutory interpretation, has now placed itself above state governments and public utility commissions on electric generation issues, not to mention DOE, FERC, or other federal agencies. Last month, the D.C. Circuit ruled that absent, and I quote, clear and specific grant of jurisdiction, end quote, federal government cannot regulate areas of the electricity market left by the Federal Power Act to the states, like electricity generation and intrastate transmission. But what EPA calls flexibilities in its proposed reg, changing dispatch rules, mandating efficiency, utilizing other generation sources, are in fact the very intrastate generation, transmission, and distribution matters explicitly reserved by the Federal Power Act for the states. So where do you see specifically the clear and specific grant of jurisdiction over intrastate electricity matters? Where is the site that you can refer to?
Chairman Upton, this is not an energy plan. This is a rule done within the four corners of 111D that looks to the best system of emission reduction to reduce emissions. No state is required to enter into any particular agreement or take interstate efforts. We are not controlling the power sector through this.
So you don't have a specific site, right? Is that right? Because
disagree with your
neither
premise.
DOE nor FERC has the authority to dictate how states plan and operate their energy system. So if they can't do it, what authority does EPA have to mandate that the states actually restructure their electric systems and subject state energy decisions to federal oversight and control?
That's not what the rule does. The rule is a pollution control rule, as EPA has traditionally done under Section 111D.
Then why do they have targets?
Yeah. Well, assuming that you did have the legal authority to go forward with the rule, have you identified all the federal and state agencies that would have to play a role in the redesigning of the state electricity systems under the proposed rule?
We've been talking to many agencies at state and federal level, but it is state governments, as they always are with respect to 111D plans, that will be responsible for putting these plans together.
So as we look at EPA's budget, and this year EPA took a reduction in their appropriation level. It was an agreed-upon amount in a bipartisan way from the CR that was passed 6-1 last January. Have you identified more funding or personnel that's going to be required at the federal level to conduct this review and oversight for existing plants?
These are state plans. The states will put them together, and EPA will act in its traditional role with respect to state air quality planning.
But you've still got, you've got the hammer to go after them. So is it going to be a new folks engaged in that?
We think states will want to take a leadership role on this.
What if they don't? I heard the West Virginia governor saying that every utility in his state would be closed. Every coal-fired facility in his state was going to be closed.
I think that states are going to want to be in the lead on these plans.
I think I know where they want to be.
Well, I also would suggest that our plan certainly does not require that all coal plants be closed in that state or any state.
Well, I'll leave that for Mr. McKinley to ask. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Doesn't the EPA, under the Clean Air Act, set standards that states have to meet, which affect their energy resources within that state?
To the extent that it addresses pollution emissions, yes.
So this is not unprecedented.
It is not.
Okay. I understand EPA asked a lot of stakeholders for input. Did the states ask for greater flexibility, or did they argue that EPA should just tell them what to do?
They were very strenuously arguing for greater flexibility and, in fact, the ability to use some of the very tools that we've outlined in our proposal.
You indicated there are a number of ways that the states can meet the objective of reducing the carbon pollution coming from the power plants. And it's up to the states to design how to do it, but they have to achieve that goal. Mm-hmm. This isn't a mandate from Washington how to accomplish the goal. It sounds to me like a mandate from Washington to achieve the goal.
That's correct.
Isn't that the way the Clean Air Act has always worked since 1970?
With respect to 111D and some other elements of the Clean Air Act, that's exactly right.
The arguments I hear from the other side is, one, they don't believe the science. Two, they don't think there's anything to do. Three, this is not good enough because it doesn't achieve the goals. Four, it tells the states what to do. It seems like every one of those points is incorrect. And then they come up with an argument that this is going to have a bad impact on the economy. Did you look at whether this will have a negative impact on the economy, or do you have people who make the claim that it's going to help the economy.
Well, we looked at the expected impacts on the power sector, and we also looked at and heard from a lot of states that are moving forward aggressively with some of the very measures that we outline in the proposal. And indeed, those states are enjoying job growth and additional investment in innovative strategies and the creation of jobs in pursuance of things like energy efficiency.
I asked that we put in the record a paper that we drafted of all the quotes over the last 40 years of the industries who said they couldn't achieve what the EPA was asking them to achieve under the law passed by Congress on a bipartisan basis. They said they couldn't achieve it without closing down their businesses or suffering dire economic consequences. We hear exaggerated claims about electricity costs, job losses, and even impaired electric reliability. These are doomsday claims. We've heard them before. And in the paper we put out, we showed how these claims were made and how inaccurate they were. What has been the history of the advances made under the Clean Air Act to give us some guidance as to whether we have to choose between clean air or a strong economy?
We don't have to make that choice between clean air and strong economy. And Congressman, I think as you've illustrated, the history of the Clean Air Act shows that we do not. The air has gotten cleaner and the economy has grown, and the United States has been a global leader in pollution control technology, energy efficiency investments, and we expect that to continue with this program as well.
We heard a claim on the other side of the aisle that the CPA proposed rule would have no impact on public health. Can you give us your view of that?
We disagree with that. In fact, as I noted, the rule will result in 25% reduction in soot and smog pollutants, as well as 30% reduction in climate carbon pollutants. All of these issues affect public health, and reducing those emissions, taking them out of the air, will improve public health.
So this isn't just to deal with the global problem of a warming planet that leads to climate change, but it'll have an impact on the health of people near some of these power plants?
That's right. Those are important co-benefits of the rule.
Mm-hmm. Well, I compliment you on the rule. I think it makes a lot of sense. It gives a lot of flexibility, and it achieves the goals. And it encourages entrepreneurship to develop the industry and technology that will make us the leader in the world to accomplish these goals. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to be here. And no.
I'm sorry. Mr. Barton actually was on the list first. Okay. And Mr. Shimkus is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad Mr. Waxman's here because he and many of my friends on the other side have seen this poster before. These are the real life job losses from the last Clean Air Act. Kincaid, Illinois, I've invited you all to come by there. 1,200 miners lost their job under a flexible system controlled by the state. State made the decision, this mine closed, 1,200 miners. So those of us who talk about this debate, we're trying to save our coal miner jobs in this country. And the President promised to make electricity generation by coal so expensive that he would drive that out of our market. Promise to the San Francisco Chronicle, well documented. He's just following up on his promise. So those of us in coal regions of this country are under attack, and we have to deal with this, with our constituency and the debate. So that's why there's a lot of emotion, as you can imagine. Also part of my portfolio here is the nuclear portfolio, the nuclear side. And so there's some curious things about this rule that that creates a problem based upon states that had clean burning nuclear power or generators that have shut down, but still have a standard by which now they can't meet because we're incentivizing the closing of nuclear power, which if we're in the clean air, climate change, we should be incentivized. Let me give you an example. 2013, 4 nuclear reactors prematurely closed. One of those reactors was Kewaunee plant in Wisconsin. When you all set the reduction target for Wisconsin, it did so based on electricity production in 2012, a year in which Kewaunee was still operating. So you're calculating your reductions a year when you've got a nuclear plant operating, no carbon emissions. That facility closed. Now that state, and many states that have nuclear power, I have one of the largest nuclear power generating states in the country, is now disproportionately harmed by these rules. Extremely harmed. So the result is that Wisconsin will be forced to compensate for the loss of this plant and reduces emissions even further than the EPA target. Is that correct? Is that analysis all correct?
So let me explain, Congressman.
Quickly, please, as quickly as you can.
Yep. So this rule addresses the fossil fuel sector. That's our responsibility under 111D. So that's where we start. And our job is to identify the best system of emission reduction for fossil-fired plants. That doesn't include nuclear. So in 2012, we looked at the emissions in each state from their fossil generation. And we then looked at what that best system of emission reduction from a national basis would result in 2030. We recognize that there are states that rely on nuclear power that is zero carbon emitting. That's very good for carbon intensity.
But we are disenfranchising those states that have the nuclear option.
We're, in fact, giving states credit for some portion of nuclear in their compliance
But to meet the standard, they have to even have more cuts, especially when a plant has closed, because you're basing that off the emissions in 2012. But their generating portfolio was based upon a nuclear plant that was operating.
This is not an energy plan for the state. This is a.
That's our problem.
But that's not our job to do.
But that's the problem for our ratepayers. And because if a generating facility that has zero emissions drops off 1,200 megawatt, 800 megawatts, whatever the base load is, they have to make that up. Otherwise, their costs are going to go up. And so we're not taking into consideration in this carbon debate zero emitting. We should be incentivizing this, should we not?
We are, and for any state that uses zero emitting generation to replace coal-fired generation or to meet their needs, they absolutely will be able to count that in their compliance plan and move them towards their goal.
Okay, let me get to these final last questions, and I appreciate that answer. What happens if the EPA doesn't approve a state implementation plan?
There's a provision, there's a little bit of language in 111D that says if we're not in a position to approve a state plan, then EPA is to move forward with a plan for that.
You will have a federal implementation plan.
We are not focused on that right now.
But that's what the law will be. The rule would be.
That's what the law provides.
What will that federal implementation plan look like?
We have not come anywhere near to
I would
proposing a
suggest
federal
you start
implementation
looking
plan.
at that and be prepared to answer questions on that. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Administrator. Last fall, EPA Administrator McCarthy met with our Governor, Steve Beshear, to discuss the proposed rule, and after that meeting, Kentucky sent a framework to EPA with recommendations on ways to develop a rule that would reduce carbon pollution cost effectively while offering our state the flexibility in meeting the new standards. My understanding is that EPA followed almost all of the Commonwealth's recommendations. Is that correct?
I believe so, Congressman.
Thank you. And those included, again, allowing states to reduce emissions flexibly using measures such as energy efficiency, renewable energy, and fuel switching to natural gas, rather than forcing states to reduce emissions in any specific plant. Also recognizing differences among states' resource potential, current generation portfolios, and allowing a variety of compliance options, including energy efficiency and so forth, as you said. But here's another example of how that flexibility can help. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act established a rebate program to help spur development and adoption of energy-efficient appliances to replace older, less efficient appliances. General Electric has a major manufacturing facility in my district, and because of that program, they were able to bring a manufacturing line of refrigerators from Mexico back to Louisville and creating hundreds of jobs in the process. Does the proposed rule allow states to take credit for reductions achieved through energy-efficient initiatives like this one?
Certainly, any program that encourages or incentivizes or provides for ways for people to save energy, which means less carbon going up the stack, are completely creditable under the plan.
Great. Well, we're happy that EPA agrees with that. That's a good example of how to create flexibility and also create energy efficiency and help consumers save money and reduce emissions. You know, I'm glad the chairman mentioned Waxman Markey earlier in his opening remarks, because I was one of a group of 10 or 12 or so representatives from states that were heavily dependent on coal-based energy, who went to our leadership at the time. Rick Boucher from Virginia led that effort, and we basically said to our leadership and to Mr. Waxman that we couldn't support the bill as it was originally drafted, that it would have been devastating for our consumers and our businesses. And they made changes in that bill. And before I voted for that bill, I talked to all of the major consumers of energy in my district, General Electric being one. Ford Motor Company has two major manufacturing facilities. The University of Louisville, the Jefferson County Public School System, Louisville Metro Government, UPS, we're the global hub of UPS. And not one of those users of electricity objected to that law, proposed law, and said they were either for it or neutral on it, saying we could live with it. I talked to our utility company and asked what the impact of that law would be on the residential customers, and they said we think that after 10 years, the average residential user will have their rates go up 15% if they do nothing else. They don't adjust their thermostat, they don't change light bulbs, they don't insulate, so forth. So if they were paying $200 a month at the beginning of the period, 10 years from now, they would be paying $230 a month. So I feel pretty comfortable that I could vote on that, and knowing that there would be minimal negative impact on my constituents. So I'm glad that the chairman compared what the EPA rule does now to that law back then. And I want proposed law back then, which Republicans in the Senate killed. But I want to get to this whole scare tactic of manufacturing businesses being affected and moving out of states and so forth, because, again, I haven't heard from any of my major manufacturers, and I have a lot of them in my district. They're not afraid of this proposed rule. So my question is to you, assuming that, it's not easy to move a manufacturing company. Ford has almost a couple $2 billion invested in my district in their two plants. So they just can't pick up and leave, even if the energy went up. But you've made an estimate of what the increase potential rates would be, even in the short term of this. I think it was about 3%. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it seems hard to logically predict that a 3% rise in a manufacturing company's rates would be enough of a financial disincentive to force them to pick up a major investment and move somewhere else. Is that part of the calculation that you did when you were creating this rule?
Well, energy efficiency is good for everybody and good for business. I think we all know that. As you say, the increases in electricity prices we see are modest in the short term and then go down over the long term. So I think businesses will take that into account.
Great. Thank you. I yield back.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Am I not correct, Administrator McCabe, when I say that this proposal that we're discussing today is not actually required by the Clean Air Act? Isn't that a true statement?
No, it is required when we issue a 111B standard for a sector to then go forward with a 111D standard.
Well, I think that's wrong. I think it is allowed, but I don't see any statutory authority that demands these proposals. I do accept that there is a Supreme Court case and a presidential finding of endangerment that allows the Clean Air Act to be used, but I see nowhere in the statute that this has to happen. You agree with that?
Respectfully, no. I believe the Clean Air Act
and if you believe that, I want the General Counsel of the EPA to back that up. Will you do that?
Sure.
Send it to the committee?
Yep.
My understanding that is what you're attempting to propose is directed by a presidential speech dated June the 25th, 2013, that was called the Climate Action Plan, that has then been followed up by a presidential memo where some of these requirements were directed towards the EPA to implement that. I would assume that you're aware of this memo.
I am.
Okay. Can you tell me what the legal force of a presidential memo is?
Well, the President's memo and Climate Action Plan laid out a series of steps that are within the responsibility of EPA and other agencies to move forward with. The President gave us a schedule on which to move forward with this rulemaking, but directed that we undertake the rulemakings that are within our authority under the Clean Air Act to address
Well, I accept that the
challenge.
President has the right to give speeches, and I even accept the fact that the President has the right to issue memos, and as the Chief Executive Officer of the federal government, to direct that the executive branch, in this case your agency, the EPA, to try to implement those presidential memos. But I don't accept that this is something that absolutely has to be done, and whatever documentation you can provide that shows that this is a forcing authority, I would like to have. And in your statement, you went to some lengths to talk about all the flexibility that the states are going to have. I'm told in the case of Texas, the decisions were made before the state of Texas even had an opportunity to comment, that they received a memo or a checklist almost after the fact. Are you aware of that?
I'm not sure what you're referring to, Congressman. We had many conversations with states, both individually and in groups. And, of course, this is a proposal, so we are still taking comment from people. I've had at least multiple hours of conversation with states even since June 2nd. So there's been lots of opportunity to talk.
Well, just as an example, are you aware of the fact that if Texas closed down every existing fossil fuel generation plant in the state, every one, every coal-fired plant, every natural gas plant in the state of Texas, that it would still not meet the new proposed ESPS? Are you aware of that?
The plan relies on states implementing a number.
I'm not asking I'm asking if you're aware of that in the case of Texas. If we shut down every coal-fired plant and every natural gas plant in the state, every one, we can't meet these suggested goals.
I haven't done that calculation, Congressman.
Well, I would suggest that you do it. Texas would end up with a new source performance standard that is below EPA's own standard. The EPA standard is 1,000 pounds of CO2 per million megawatts per megawatt of production, and for Texas to actually meet what the EPA is suggesting it should, we'd have to go down to 791, which is about 21% below your own standard. I mean, the renewable standard for Texas is based on the renewable portfolio standard for Kansas. Now, I'm not anti-Kansas. I want Mr. Pompeo to know. But Kansas electricity demand and generation is 10% of the state of Texas. Texas leads the nation in renewable generation, and Texas produces 3 times as much energy by renewable as the next 3 states combined.
Texas has immense opportunities when it comes to
and we get no credit
energy.
for that in your proposal.
Well,
None. None.
The state does, actually. And
Well, the state of Texas tells me they don't.
Well, we're happy to have further conversations with the state of Texas about the goal.
My time has expired.
Gentleman's time's expired.
Put me down as extremely undecided on this proposal.
Yeah, I will. This time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you, Ms. McCabe, for coming here today. You mentioned that the EPA predicts a reduction in energy costs, family energy bills, I take it, by the year 2030.
Yes.
Would you elaborate on that bit and maybe give us some idea of what the reduction estimates look like?
Sure, sure. So as the states implement their plans, we expect a large reliance on demand side and energy efficiency measures that will reduce the number of kilowatts a family needs to consume over the course of a month. And so when we project that out, we show that it's about an 8% decrease in a bill, in a family's bill.
So American family might look to something almost like 10% of reduction in their monthly energy bills by 2030 as a result of this rule, as the proposed rule.
That's what the proposed rule predicts, based on our forecasts. Of course, each state, as I've said, will do its own plan.
Well, that's not too bad. Would you please describe the outreach that the EPA conducted to the various states? Give us some idea of the magnitude of that effort.
Sure. We started last August, well before we even put pen to paper on the rule. It's, in my experience of decades in working first from the state side, most of my career from the state side, I'm not aware of EPA ever doing this kind of outreach. So we, and it was broad ranging with all stakeholders, but in particular with respect to states. We met with states in groups. They have regional organizations. We met with those regional organizations. Our regional offices convened groups of state officials, both from the environmental and the energy side, as well as other stakeholders and utilities.
Were most states cooperative, or did they stand aside and give a a less cooperative stance?
Oh, I would say that there was great interest and continues to be great interest from the state officials on talking with us about the program.
Would you describe the reduction of conventional pollution, its projected impact on health, and the monetary impacts of those health benefits from these rules if implemented?
Sure. So as co-benefits of reducing carbon, there will also be reductions in particle pollution, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, which have very immediate and localized as well as regional health benefits. And we predict about a 25% in reduction of those pollutants compared to what they would otherwise be in 2030 without this rule. So that will result in reduced asthma attacks, reduced emergency room visits, reduced missed days of school, in the billions of dollars of health benefits to the American people.
Is there any way to talk about the return on investment that might have to be made by the different states?
Well, we do show that for every dollar invested, there's a $7 return in public health benefits as a result of the program.
And would these investments be made by states or by the private entities involved?
Well, they would be made by the private entities, the businesses investing in technology, investing in new workers to employ energy efficiency around the state, and with all the benefits that those bring.
Well, you know, I understand the 4 pillars of this are increasing operating efficiency of the different plants. What could be more reasonable than that? Using gas-fired plants at 70% of their capacity, which is a good idea if you have a gas-fired plant. In fact, gas is more affordable now than many other forms. Using renewable energy that's applicable locally to the state, and using nuclear as long as possible, and encouraging user efficiency, end-user efficiency. So these are all pretty reasonable in my mind. I don't see how that would be viewed, any of those, as too intrusive. Are there other measures that can be taken that would also help reduce pollution that are included in this rule?
Yeah, those are so reasonable that they're being done in a widespread manner. But there are other things that states or utilities can think about doing. There's other types of fuel switching they can do. They can look at their transmission systems and see whether there's leakage there that can be tightened up. So there are a number of other things that folks can do.
And the last thing is the state flexibility. I mean, I understand there's a great deal of flexibility the states have adopted, and it'll make it a lot easier for the different states to implement these proposed rules.
Yes, that's right.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
This time, I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much for being with us today. We greatly appreciate it. Last week, the governor of Ohio signed a piece of legislation citing energy costs and economic growth concerns that put a 2-year freeze on Ohio's renewable energy mandate that the state had imposed on itself. I'd like you to consider this hypothetical situation going into the future. Assume that the Ohio Renewable Energy Standard was included in its state implementation plan, the SIP, and to comply with the EPA's existing plant rule. Assume also that the EPA approved that SIP, okay? In that scenario, would the state of Ohio maintain its discretion to freeze the renewable energy program in order to protect the interests of Ohioans?
The state would continue to have flexibility if circumstances change in the state to replace one particular measure with another, and the proposal lays out the process by which a state could do that. So there's opportunities for states to adjust their plans along.
Okay, let me ask then, would the state have to get that approval from the EPA?
If a state wants to replace one measure with another, they would come to EPA and say this is what we're doing.
Okay, and how would the process overall work, and how much time would it take for a state to get that implemented then, if they want to make a change?
Well, we work with states all the time in circumstances where they wish to change their state implementation plans, and so we work with the state to prioritize those actions and try to meet the state's needs in terms of timing.
And then also, would Ohio be subject to Clean Air Act penalties if they didn't first obtain any EPA approval before they make any implementation to a change at that time?
I don't believe so, Congressman. The provisions in the Clean Air Act for penalties are pretty clearly laid out, and there's a pretty clear process for when those could be invoked. So I think in any circumstance like this, we would work with the state to make sure that they could do what they needed to do as long as it met the ultimate goal.
Well, just to be on the safe side, if we get that back to the committee, that they wouldn't face penalties if that would occur?
Sure,
Okay.
we'll answer further.
Okay, let me, and also just talking about a little bit about Ohio. We get about 70% of our generation in the state of Ohio comes from coal. And in my district, which I have about 60,000 manufacturing jobs, it's even higher than that we're coal-based generation. And up in my area of the state, I also have a very unique situation, and I have a lot of electric co-ops. So how would the EPA's Clean Power Plan avoid putting these small co-ops at a competitive disadvantage, and especially their customers? Because again, in my district, when you look who they're serving, you're talking about a lot of farm. It's very unique. I have 60,000 manufacturing jobs. I also have the largest number of farmers in the state of Ohio. How do you put them not at a competitive disadvantage under the Clean Power Plan? Because, again, you've got the farmers, you've got these small businesses out there, you've got a lot of retirees.
Yeah.
What happens? How do we make sure they're not at a competitive disadvantage?
Well, this is where the design of Section 111D and the flexibility in the plan really shows its value. It's because it will be up to the state of Ohio to design a plan that works for the state of Ohio. I come from Indiana, and so it's very similar in terms of the types of
well, if I could just interrupt, because you coming from Indiana, you know that just a few years ago, especially when the president was talking about his cap and tax plan, that when Ohio was at about 78% generation in coal, Indiana was at about 90%. So they're really in harm's way when it comes to these new rules and standards. So excuse me for interrupting.
No, I gave you the opening. I actually don't think they're in harm's way. I think that the way we've designed the plan is very respectful of the fact that states like Ohio and Indiana do rely heavily on coal. They have different opportunities than states with a different energy mix, and they can design a plan that addresses concerns related to small rural co-ops public power, particular concerns. This plan works. It doesn't require any particular plant to meet any particular emission rate. So, and it looks at emissions over a long averaging period. So that's another way in which the plan gives lots of flexibility for the state to be able to adjust to its particular needs, its manufacturing community, its rural communities, cities, whatever the particular needs are.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired, and I yield back.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have a little different Texas accent, and I'm sorry my colleague from Texas, Joe Barton, is a good friend, and we work together on a lot of things. EPA does have the authority to regulate CO2 under the Clean Air Act. The Supreme Court ruled it, and the rule we're discussing today will have significant impact for decades on industries in my area in Houston. The issue of climate change is one of the most important issues we should face as a Congress. The EPA has constructed a framework that provides states with the flexibility and opportunity. It's important to remember those 4 building blocks proposed by the rules are not the exhaustive list. The 4 building blocks are merely a prescription for success. States are allowed to construct a plan that matches their needs and those of their affected communities. And as I said before, the EPA is legally justified in regulating carbon. I would prefer Congress take the lead in doing it. I believe as elected officials we have the duty to act on behalf of our constituents to regulate these pollutants. Again, Ms. McCabe, I'm sure you're aware EPA in my home state of Texas have some issues in the past. And for more than 3 years, EPA was responsible for issuing GHG permits, which caused significant problems for our industry looking to build and expand even new facilities. Just this last week, the governor of Texas, along with 6 other state governors, sent a letter to the president asking him to dispose of the carbon rule. It's my hope that we'll not go down that path again. My first question, having said that, Ms. McCabe, can you explain to the committee what concerns your office received from stakeholder groups, including states, as you prepared the rules, and what did the EPA do to mitigate these concerns? And obviously, from my part of the country, I'd appreciate if Texas had some input and if you and how you responded to it.
Yes, we heard a number of very specific things from states and other stakeholders. We heard that states wanted to be able to, for example, do their own plans, or they wanted the ability to perhaps join with other states and do a multi-state plan, and our proposal allows for that. States were very concerned about the time that they would have for 2 things: 1, to develop a plan, and 2, to actually achieve the carbon reductions. And so our proposal responds to both of those, first by giving an extended compliance time period all the way out to 2030 with a long glide path down to that, but also in response to their first concern, how long would they have to submit a plan, we have provided for either a 1 or a 2-year extension for states to get them some additional time to put their plans together if they need that. Another thing that we heard from states is to allow them the flexibility to either craft their plan around a rate-based approach or a total tons of carbon emitted approach if that's the way they wanted to manage their plan. And so our plan allows for both of those approaches.
Okay. I've reviewed the rule and the 4 proposed building blocks. EPA has estimated that the majority of the carbon reductions from the state of Texas would come from building blocks. Two of them utilization of the existing natural gas compound cycle power plants. However, there are other additional reductions calculated under building blocks 3 and 4. And you may know Texas has more wind generation than any other state. Texas was the first state in the nation to pass legislation establishing energy efficiency resources.